Monica Gibson, and today I'm joined in the studio by David Mapely from City Windmills to discuss renewable energy. David, thank you very much for coming in today.
Good morning.
Now, renewable energy, there has been a bit of a shift from the more traditional energies, but could you tell us a little bit about these renewable energies and sort of these trends that we're seeing?
Certainly. Well, of course, the big drivers have been the move away from nuclear energy and the rising cost of hydrocarbons or oil and gas. So people have been looking at how they can harness the tremendous amount of solar energy potential that's out there, and wind and tide and water. And over the number of years there have been initiatives led by many governments following Kyoto to see what they can do to, in a very green way or low carbon footprint, create energy for communities, for cities and dwellings, and even more remote installations that can't really access the grid or can't be fully supplied against the demand they generate.
Now, I also imagine that global warming, for example, will play a bit of a part in this movement away. Could you tell us a little bit about that and what impact it's actually having?
Sure. Well, global warming actually has two impacts on society. First of all is the perceived rise in temperatures, which leads to perhaps a better deployment of solar energy, because it's not direct sunlight but just radiation which drives solar energy. But secondarily, of course, a byproduct is a lot more wind, and you've seen so much more in the way of storms up and down the east coast of the US and in northern Europe in the last few years as a result of these changes in thermals and currents.
Now, you mentioned the overarching theme of today's conversation is renewable energy, but the last mile, does it let you down? What do you mean by that, David?
Well, our business is partly based in the US, and we are seeing two things happening. First of all, infrastructure isn't in place in the US, that you may have wind farms, nuclear power stations, but if trees fall down and cut off your house, you're suddenly in the middle of winter without power. And it's one would presume a fundamental right to have some power when you're paying for it, but infrastructure is not in place to connect you between the grid. It fails all the time, as you saw with Northern Ireland yesterday, 37,000 homes without electricity, which may take a week or so to fix. Secondarily, with growing populations, all using more and more electronic goods around the house, demand is still increasing, and suddenly we have this squeeze where we're being told in the next few years that nuclear is being phased out, which will cause tremendous problems within the infrastructure of Europe. So you have supply reducing and demand increasing from population growth and demographics. And there's an imbalance there. And people are starting to say, well, am I therefore allowed to generate electricity in my own home? Because if my collection, that last mile to the grid that I'm paying for, is subject to peak tariffs now and shortages or brownouts, well, why not can I use the environment around me to harness that power, because that last mile is not delivering what I'm paying for. And that's now become a political football.
Now, there are obvious reasons for a push towards more greener and more environmental friendly energies, but they're not without their problems either. For instance, can renewable energy really meet the demands of an increase in population, would you say?
Certainly they can. I think statistically they tell you that the Earth gets us enough radiation 1 hour from the sun to drive all the electricity requirements of the whole planet for a year. I mean, there's a lot of money going into technology. I think unfortunately it's still very expensive. That's the problem. People say, well, it all sounds very good and green, but realistically, you know, times are hard, the economy is in crisis, I need to basically have my power and want it as cheap as possible. But that imbalance is starting to change, where, as you saw with what happened with solar heating, despite solar tech collapsing a few days ago, the price was driven down dramatically by Chinese exports of solar panels, and actually made the industry somewhat affordable very, very quickly. So people are now saying, well, alternatives or greens are not only make me feel better, but they are now actually affordable. They are becoming a viable solution or an alternative to just being plugged into the grid. And legislation is now supporting the fact that if I produce surplus electricity in my house, I can sell it back into the grid and get credits for it, which is an added financial incentive. So we're certainly moving in the right direction, and I think people can look at alternatives or renewables and say, I can now actually produce this myself and even sell it back. So it makes the deal look more inviting.
You mentioned their startup cost. That's obviously going to play heavily on people's minds. But what are the overarching benefits of renewable energy, and do they really outweigh the difficulties that are presented?
Sure. It was like probably 20 years ago when double glazing was being introduced into Europe, and the payback was maybe 20 years, and people were saying, you know, I'm going to be in my house for 5 years and move on. And therefore it wasn't really becoming a viable investment. Now, of course, double glazing is a standard, and almost without that in your house, you reduce the value of your house. Same is now going on with solar or wind, where people initially were saying it's too expensive to put in, and you know, are we sure it really works? Now we know it works. Now it's becoming much, much cheaper, and the fact they can actually now sell it back into the grid means I can do this. This is a proposition now that makes my house more value. Plus, with payback for wind of less than 3 years and solar of 7 to 9 years, if you're in your house for a long time, that investment makes a lot of sense. And of course, when there's an interruption to the grid, you still have power, which is key, especially in winter.
So everyone leaves busy life, so therefore, you know, power is essential. But David, thank you very much for your insights.
My pleasure.
Insights today. It's been very interesting speaking to you.
Thank you very much, Monica.
Well, that's all from David and myself, but please click back to Dukascopy TV for more interesting interviews throughout the day. Bye for now.